Hello, this is our MMT presentation on forearm and wrist. The first movements we will be doing is elbow flexion and extension. Here is an example of elbow flexion. And so the prime movers for elbow flexion are the biceps brachii, brachialis, and brachioradialis. The secondary movers are the pronator teres, extensor carpi radialis longus, flexor carpi ulnaris, and flexor carpi radialis. So first, to test elbow flexion with gravity eliminated, the patient will be short sitting with shoulder abducted to 90 degrees and internally rotated and supported by the therapist. To test the biceps brachii, the forearm will be supinated. To test the brachioradialis, the forearm will be in neutral. And to test the brachialis, the forearm will be pronated. The patient will attempt to flex the elbow. So first, we're going to be testing your biceps brachii. So go ahead and point your thumb towards the ceiling. Try to bend your elbow. Good, that will be a score of 2. Now we're going to test your brachialis. So go ahead and point your thumb towards the floor. And go ahead and try to bend your elbow. Good, that will be a score of 2. Now point your thumb towards that wall and try to bend your elbow. Okay, good. That will also be a score of 2, and that was testing the brachioradialis. Okay, Claire, so go ahead and point your thumb towards that wall over there. Okay, and try to bend your elbow. All right, so I felt a little contraction in your brachioradialis, but your arm did not move, so that would be a score of 1. All right, now go ahead and point your thumb towards the ceiling. And then go ahead and try to bend your elbow. All right, so I felt a contraction there, but your arm did not move, so that would also be a score of 1 at your biceps brachii. And now you're going to go ahead and point your thumb towards the floor into pronation, and then go ahead and try to bend your elbow. Okay, so I felt a little contraction in your brachialis, so that would also be a score of 1. If I didn't feel a contraction in any of those 3 muscles, then that would be a score of 0. So to test elbow flexion against gravity, the patient will be seated on a supportive chair or mat. The patient will flex their elbow through range of motion, and the therapist will stabilize under the elbow joint. So for this one, you're going to go ahead and have your palm facing the ceiling, and then you're going to flex up towards your shoulder. Good, that'll be a 3. All right, so now you're going to go ahead and flex your elbow, hold it, don't let me pull it down. Good, that'll be a 4. Keep this position. I'm going to apply a little more resistance. Hold it, don't let me pull it down. Good, that'll be a 5. So you can go ahead and relax. So that was testing your biceps brachii. Now we're going to test your brachioradialis. So for this one, you're going to have your thumb facing the ceiling, and then you're going to go ahead and flex up towards your shoulder. Good, that'll be a 3. Okay, now we're going to test your brachialis. So for this one, you're going to have your palm facing the floor, and then you're going to flex your elbow up towards your shoulder. Good, that'll also be a 3. So for this one, you're going to go. So the next motion is elbow extension, and here is an example of the movement. The prime movers for elbow extension is the triceps brachii. The secondary movers is the anconeus. And to test elbow extension with gravity eliminated, the patient will be short sitting with shoulder at 90 degrees of abduction and neutral rotation with the elbow flexed to about 45 degrees, and the patient will attempt to extend their elbow. All right, so go ahead and try to straighten your elbow. Good, that would be a score of 2. Now go ahead and try to straighten your elbow again. Okay, so I felt a little contraction in your triceps brachii, so that would be a score of 1. If I didn't feel any contraction, that would be a score of 0. All right. To test elbow extension against gravity, the patient will be prone with the humerus abducted to 90 degrees. The patient will straighten their elbow into extension while the therapist is also providing stabilization underneath the arm. So go ahead and straighten the elbow. Good, that will be a 3. Now keep holding this position. I'm going to apply some resistance. Don't let me bend it. Good, that will be a 4. Now keep holding this position. I'm going to apply more resistance now. Don't let me bend it. Good, that will be a 5. You can go ahead and relax.
Now moving on to forearm supination, here's an example of a functional activity that involves this movement. So the muscles involved are the supinator and the biceps brachii for this movement. So for grades 3 to 5, the patient will be seated with elbow flexed at 90 degrees with forearm in full pronation to neutral. To test for a 3, the therapist asks the client to turn their palm up to face the ceiling. If patient is able, proceed to apply resistance to test for a 4 or a 5. To test for a 4 or 5, patient begins at neutral. Therapist grasps patient's hand as if shaking hands while using the other hand to cradle the elbow. Therapist will then apply force downward to face the patient's palm toward the floor and instruct the client to resist the force by saying, "Don't let me turn it down." All right, go ahead and turn your palm upwards to where it's facing the ceiling. That would be a 3. All right, now I'm going to apply some pressure. I'm going to try to turn your palm downwards. Don't let me do it. All right, that would be a 4. And now I'm going to apply more pressure. I'm going to try to turn your palm downwards. Don't let me do it. That would be a 5. All right, go ahead. For testing grades 2 through 0, the patient is seated with their shoulders and elbow flexed to 90 degrees. The therapist can either support or rest the patient's elbow on a table to eliminate gravity. The therapist can palpate the supinator by finding the lateral epicondyle and moving distally along the radial shaft. Beginning in pronation, therapist will instruct client to turn their palm towards their face to observe for full range of motion. If able to complete full range of motion, they would receive a 2. All right, so I'm going to find the lateral epicondyle here, go a little bit distal to feel for the supinator, and you're going to move your arm like this. So turn your palm towards you. Good, now relax. And that would be a grade of 2. Now I'm going to feel for the supinator muscle as well, and go ahead. Okay, so I felt a little bit of a contraction, but no movement, so that would be a grade of 1. If there was no movement as well as no contraction, that would be a grade of 0. Now here's an example of the same activity of turning the doorknob, but demonstrating the forearm pronation portion. The primary muscles are the pronator teres and the pronator quadratus, and the secondary muscles are the flexor carpi radialis. So for grades 3 to 5, the patient will be seated with elbow flexed at 90 degrees with forearm in full supination. To test for a 3, the therapist asks the client to turn their palm downward towards the floor. If patient is able to perform this task, proceed to apply force to test for a 4 or a 5. To test for a 4 or a 5, patient begins at neutral. Therapist again grasps patient's hand as if shaking hands while using the other hand to cradle the elbow. Therapist will then apply force upward to face the patient's palm toward the ceiling and instruct the client to resist the force by saying, "Don't let me turn it up." All right, go ahead and turn your palm downward. Good, that would be a 3. All right, now I'm gonna try to turn your palm upwards. Don't let me do it. I'm gonna apply some pressure, okay? 3, 2, 1. Good, now that would be a 4. Now I'm gonna apply more pressure. I'm gonna try to turn your palm upward. Don't let me do it. 3, 2, 1. That would be a 5. All right. Now for testing grades 2 through 0, the patient is seated with their shoulder and elbow flexed to 90 degrees. The therapist can either support or rest the patient's elbow on the table to eliminate gravity. Therapist then palpates the pronator teres by finding the distal bicep tendon in the antecubital space and moving distally and medially to run along the path of the pronator teres. Beginning in supination, therapist instructs the client to turn their palm away from themselves, observing full range of motion. If they are able to complete this, they would receive a 2. All right, so we're going to move your palm away from you, just like that, okay? 3, 2, 1. Good, so that would be a grade of 2. All right, now we're going to do the same thing. Move your palm away from you towards me. All right, so there was a slight contraction but no movement, so that would be a score of 1. And if there was no contraction as well as no movement, that would be a score of 0.
Okay, so now we will move on to wrist flexion and extension. So using a fly swatter is an example of using wrist extension when your hand moves back and using wrist flexion when your wrist bends forward. So the prime muscles involved in wrist flexion are the flexor carpi radialis and the flexor carpi ulnaris. The secondary movers are the flexor digitorum superficialis, the flexor digitorum profundus, and the flexor pollicis longus. So to test wrist flexion against gravity, for a grade of 3, we will have the patient seated with their forearm in supination and wrist in a neutral position. We would then tell the patient to bend their hand forward. They will attain the grade of 3 for both wrist flexors if they are able to complete full range of motion without resistance. To only test the FCR, the patient will have the wrist in radial deviation and then flex, and to only test the FCU, you will have the patient's wrist in ulnar deviation and then flex. If sufficient range is present, you will proceed to test strength with one hand supporting the forearm under the wrist and the other hand applying resistance over the palmar surface of the hand. You will tell the patient, bend your wrist forward, hold it. Don't let me pull it down. If they're able to hold the test position against moderate resistance, that will be 4. To test the FCR for grade 4, they will have their hand radially deviated and flex while you are applying moderate resistance at the first and second metacarpal in an extension and ulnar direction. To test the FCU, they will have their hand ulnarly deviated and flexed while you give moderate resistance over the fifth metacarpal in extension and radial direction. To test for both or either muscles for grade 5, you will apply the same procedures as grade 4 except applying max resistance. Okay, Ramon, I'm going to have you bring your palm forward to your face whenever you're ready. That would be a score of 3, and I'm going to ask you to deviate to the pinky side, and I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. Okay, that would also be a grade of 3, and now I'm going to bring you to your thumb side and ask you to flex again. That would also be a grade of 3. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to do the same thing, but I'm going to add some moderate resistance. Go ahead. That would be a grade of 4, and now I'm going to bring you back to this side, and I'm going to push in the opposite direction and down. Don't let your hand come down. That would be a grade of 4, and now for the other side, you're going to do the same thing, and I'm going to put more resistance. Go ahead. That would be a grade of 4. So now I'm going to add the maximum resistance. Go ahead and bring your palm up. That's a grade 5 for both, and now to your pinky side, go ahead and bring it up. That would be a grade of 5, and for the other side, go ahead and bring it up. That'd be a grade of 5. Okay, Ramon, I'm gonna have. So to test for wrist flexion with gravity eliminated, which is grade 2, we will have the patient sitting with their elbow on the table and flexing their wrist with the ulnar side gliding across the table. To test the wrist flexor separately, you will hold the forearm so that the wrist does not lie on the table and ask the patient to perform the flexion motion while the wrist is in ulnar or radial deviation. The test for wrist flexion for grades 1 and 0 will have the patient pronate their arm on the table and attempt to flex their wrist repeatedly while you feel for the tendons both during relaxation and contraction. The FCR lies on the lateral palmar aspect of the wrist, and the tendon of the FCU lies on the medial aspect of the wrist. Okay, Ramon, I'm going to have you bring your palm towards your face. Okay, good. I'm going to deviate it towards your thumb and have you do the same action. Okay, good. Now I'm going to deviate towards your pinky and have you do the same action. So that would be a grade of 2. And then I'm going to set you down like this, and I'm going to put my hands right here next to your muscles. And I'm going to have you bring your palm towards your face. And I felt a contraction, but there was no movement, so that would be a grade of 1. And if there were no movement or contraction, that would be a grade of 0. Okay, Ramon, I'm going to have... So the prime movers for wrist extension are the extensor carpi ulnaris, the extensor carpi radialis brevis, and the extensor carpi radialis longus. The secondary movers are the extensor digitorum, extensor digiti minimi, and the extensor indicis. So to test wrist extension against gravity, the patient will be seated with their elbow flexed at 90 degrees and their forearm fully pronated. You will ask them to lift their hand, which is a grade of 3 if they can get full range of motion. To test the carpi radialis longus and brevis, they will flex with their hand in radial deviation. And to test for carpi ulnaris, they will extend their hand in ulnar deviation. If sufficient range is present, you will apply moderate pressure, which is grade 4, by placing the resistance on the dorsal surface of the metacarpals, which is how you would test for all 3 extensors together. To test for the ECRL and the ECRB, you will give resistance on the dorsal surface of the 2nd and 3rd metacarpals. To test for the ECU, you will give resistance on the dorsal surface of the 5th metacarpal in the direction of flexion and radial deviation. A grade of 5 consists of the same procedures, instead now you apply maximum resistance. Okay, Ramon, I'm going to have you bend your hand back towards you. Okay, perfect. I'm going to deviate your hand towards your thumb and have you bring it back again. Okay, good. I'm going to have you deviate towards your pinky and then bring it back again. Good. So those were all grades of 3. Now I'm going to add resistance. Go ahead and bring your hand back. Don't let me push it down. Good. I'm going to go towards your thumb. Don't let me push you down. Good. Go towards your pinky and don't let me push it down again. Good. So now I'm going to add the max resistance. So go ahead and push your hand up. Good. I'm going to add resistance this way. Go ahead and push up. Good. And I'm going to have you come to this side. Go ahead and push up. Good. That would be a grade of 5. Okay, Ramon, I'm going to... The specific test for a patient for wrist extension with gravity eliminated is to have the patient seated and extend their wrist with the ulnar surface gliding across or not touching the table. You will ask the patient to bend their hand back. To test the wrist extensor separately, hold the forearm so that the wrist does not lie on the table and ask the patient to perform the extension motion while the wrist is in ulnar or radial deviation for their respective muscles. A grade of 1 and 0 consists of the patient's hand being pronated on the table, and you will try and palpate for contractile activity. The tendon for the ECRL lies on the dorsum of the wrist in line with the 2nd metacarpal. The tendon for the ECRB lies on the dorsal surface of the wrist in line with the 3rd metacarpal, and the tendon of the ECU lies on the dorsal wrist surface proximal to the 5th metacarpal and just distal to the ulnar styloid process. Okay, Ramon, I'm going to have you bend your hand back towards you. Okay, come back. That'd be a score of 2. I'm going to lift your hand up and deviate towards your pinky side and have you bend your hand back again. Come back. That would be another score of 2. And hand towards your thumb, bend back. And that would be another score of 2. I'm going to place your hand down this way, and I'm going to palpate for some muscles. I'm going to have you bend your hand back again. So since I didn't see any movement, but I did feel the contraction of the muscles, that would be a score of 1. And if I didn't see any movement and there was no contraction of the muscles, that would be a score of 0.
Now we will review the manual muscle testing for radial and ulnar deviation. In these demonstrations, I will act as a therapist and Jan will be my client. Here's a quick review of the motions of radial deviation and ulnar deviation. All right, so the primary movers for radial deviation are the flexor carpi radialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, and extensor carpi radialis brevis. When testing radial deviation against gravity, the client will start in a seated or supine position with the therapist sitting opposite. The forearm will be in a neutral rotation and the wrist will be in a slight extension with the thumb pointed up. When applying pressure, the therapist will stabilize under the dorsal ulnar forearm and apply pressure radially over the distal 2nd metacarpal towards ulnar deviation. Make sure that when you are applying pressure that you don't apply it to the fingers, just to the metacarpals. Okay, Jan, I'm going to have you go ahead and place your hand in a position like this with your thumb pointing up towards the ceiling. Great. And now I want you to just copy the motion that I'm doing. Okay, go ahead. Great. That would be a score of 3. Next up, I'm going to stabilize under the dorsal part of your arm, your forearm, and then I'm going to have you go ahead and do that motion again. And this time hold it, and I'm going to try and press down on it, but I want you to try and hold that position, okay? Great, that would be a score of 4. Now I want you to hold the position again, and I'm going to apply slightly more pressure, and I want you to try and hold it straight, okay? Great, that would be a score of 5.
When testing radial deviation with gravity eliminated, the client will be seated or supine with the therapist sitting opposite to the client. Rest the volar surface of the forearm and hand onto a flat surface.
Okay, Jan, go ahead and place your hand on the table like this. Okay, and I'm going to facilitate a movement for you. Okay? Now, go ahead and do that by yourself. Great, that would be a score of 2. Now, go ahead and do the movement again. Okay, and there's no movement, but there is a contraction, so that would be a score of 1. And if you were to do it again and there would be no contraction, that would be a score of 0.
Next, we will review the manual muscle testing for ulnar deviation. The primary movers for ulnar deviation are the extensor carpi ulnaris and the flexor carpi ulnaris. When testing ulnar deviation against gravity, the client will be seated or in supine, and the shoulder and elbow are flexed. The forearm and wrist are in neutral rotation, and the wrist is in a slight extension and neutral deviation. When applying pressure, the therapist will stabilize under the distal radial forearm. Pressure will be applied radially over the 5th metacarpal, again, not to the fingers. In this video demonstration, the therapist is seated in front of the client for filming purposes, but normally the therapist will be seated next to the client on the testing side.
Jan, go ahead and place your arm like mine. Okay, now what I want you to do is to flex your wrist forward, just like I did. Great, all right, and that would be a score of 3. Okay, next, I'm gonna stabilize your forearm, and I want you to go ahead and flex again like you did before. Flex again, great. And go ahead and keep it in that position. All right, now I'm gonna try and to place some pressure on it. I want you to keep it in that position, okay? Great, and that would be a score of 4. Now I'm gonna place a little bit more pressure. Go ahead and try and keep it in this position, okay? Perfect, and that would be a score of 5.
To test ulnar deviation for gravity eliminated, the client will be seated or in supine. The therapist will sit opposite to the client. The volar surface of the hand and forearm will rest on a flat surface.
Okay, Jan, I'm gonna have you go ahead and place your hand on the table like this. Perfect, all right, and now I'm gonna go ahead and move your wrist in this motion. Okay, now why don't you go ahead and try and do that for me? Great, and since you can do it independently, that would be a score of 2. Go ahead and try and do the motion again. Okay, and there's no movement, but I do feel a contraction, so that would be a score of 1. And if we were to repeat it and there's no contraction, that's going to be a score of 0.
And here are our references. Thank you for watching.